this video, we're all going to be looking at while loops. So let's get started. So first of all, we need to understand what a while loop is, right? So then we can compare it with a for loop we've actually used before. So what a while loop does is you have to place a condition in a while loop, and then what it will do is always look forward to make that condition false, and then only it will stop. So it will only run as long as that condition is true at first, but then it needs to go into false. So it's always going to try and make that condition false, right? Unlike for loops, right? They're not like that. So what while loops do is actually, when you place a condition that's actually true, they will keep on going until that condition is false. So that's the difference between for loop and while loop. Because for loop, you can loop values, you can put how long you want to loop the values, but you can't actually place a condition and wait for it to be false, right? So that's the difference between for loop and while loop. So now actually let's look at how to write a for loop. A while loop. To write a while loop, you just need to say while, and then a condition, and then a coulomb. Now you don't always have to place a condition. If you want this while loop to run forever, you would just put true, right? And then that will automatically run because that true can't ever be equal to false, right? So that's why it'll keep on running, because true is never going to be false. So that's why it would go into an infinite loop. We can try that by just printing like anything inside the while loop, like Python. Right? The syntax is exactly the same, but the while changes, the for changes to a while, and then the coulomb is exactly the same, and the conditions you have to place it right there. So there's nothing really changes except a few syntaxes. But as you can see, Python is now in an infinite loop, and it's going to keep on printing until we stop the program, because it's in an infinite loop, right? So now we've looked at that, what we're actually going to look at now is actually placing a condition. So let's just say we had a variable called I, okay, and then we set that equal to 0. And then in the while loop, what we're going to do is place a condition like while I is lower than 5, the loop has to run. So the loop would run for 5 times, because at one point I is going to be equal to 5, and then the loop would stop, because now the condition is not like, the condition is that I has to be lower than 5, and at one point it's not going to be lower than 5, so then it will stop, right? So what we do is just say while I is lower than 5. So that's it, really. It's so simple writing a while loop, because it's just like writing an English sentence. It's like while I is lower than 5, right? So very simple. And what we can do is print Python in this as well, and see if this works, okay? So that should be good, so let's run it. Oh, can you see that? Python was only meant to print 5 times, because I is only going to be at 1.5, so it has to stop at 5 loops, right? But why is it going on to an infinite loop? Well, that's what's wrong, because I, we said, is equal to 0, and we said while I is lower than 5. I is always going to be lower than 5, because we're not incrementing the I's value in any way. So it's always going to be lower than 5, right? So that's basically like the exact same as placing I true here, right? We're just replacing the true with I is lower than, while I is lower than 5, right? So there's no point in that. So we have to increment the value somewhere. And we can do that in the while loop. If you think logically, what we can do is just say I is equal to 1. And this will increment I's value by 1 every time it loops. So when we run this, it will stop running, right? It will stop running at one point, because I is only going to be lower than 5 in 5 loops, right? So it's going to run 5 times, and Python is going to print 5 times in that. So that's the basic idea of writing a for loop, right? So that's how you do a while loop. And the while loop is really simple, and we're going to be going into more complex while loops later on, but in this video we learned while loops. Okay, in the last video we actually looked at like very basic for while loop, right? So we looked at what's the difference between while loop and for loop, what is a for loop, and all that stuff. But in this video we're going to be going on to a little bit more complex stuff, which is adding if conditions to while loops, and how we can place a while loop inside a while loop, right? So nested while loops. So let's get started. So this is the while loop we've written in the last video, where we looped the while loop for 5 times, right? I don't know why that was so hard, but there we are. So we've looked at that, but what if we want to place a while loop inside a while loop? That is totally possible, okay? So before we go into that, let's actually learn to write an if condition in the while loop, right? And how to actually break a while loop in case you end up in an infinite loop. So let's get started. So this is our while loop, and I've took away the incrementing the value, which was right here, so I'm going to take that away. And what I'm going to do is place an if condition in here. We know how to place an if condition, right? We just say if, and after that, we just place whatever condition we want, right? So I'm just going to say if I, maybe I just say if I is equal to 5, go in this if condition. And automatically, at one point, I will be equal to 5, right? Well, that's wrong because we are only saying while I is lower than 5. So it's never actually going into I is not going to be actually greater than 5 at any point. So we need to say while I is greater than, lower than or equal to 5, okay? And then it will go into the, because at one point 5 will be equal to I, right? So I will be equal to 5. So, okay, so that's good. It will go into the if condition and the last loop. But what do you want to put in the last loop? So this is where we can print, let's just say you want to print end of the loop. Okay, so you just want to say end of the loop. So what's special about this is that this will only print at the end of the loop. So when I run this, but we forget one thing. We need to also increment the value of I. So let me just do that. So I is plus is equal to, okay, I is plus is equal to 1, okay? You have to place it outside the if condition because it's going to go into the if condition at the end of the loop, but we need to still increment the value till then, right? So let's just go ahead and run this. Okay, there we are. And as you can see, we looped the loop, right? And it went for 6 times this time. But the end, we got the end of the for loop, right? End of the loop. So that's cool, but why did it print 6 times? Well, that's because the loop starts from 0, as we know, and it goes on to 5. So the difference between 0 and 5 is 6, if you start counting. So 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So that's 6, so that's why we printed Python 6 times. But the important thing to notice here is that we got end of the loop at the end of the loop, which is quite sick, right? We were able to actually control the the while loop using the if statement. Right, so now let's look at how to place a while loop inside a while loop. So this is what's called a nested while loop, okay? So when you place a while loop inside a while loop, right, it's called nested while loop, okay? So let's go ahead and do that. So first of all, we need to learn what basically, how can you place a while loop inside a while loop, right? It's very simple. So what you have to do is just like write a while loop like you normally would, but you have to put that inside the while loop you've already written, okay? So that's the only thing you have to do to write a while loop. And then inside that nested while loop you've written, you can put whatever you want in there as well, and that it will only go into that while loop if, you will automatically go into that while loop every time it goes into the loop itself. So let me show you how to write that. So let's just say we take all this off, okay? Okay, let me just keep the incrementing of the value in there. But here, inside the while loop, I'm going to write another while loop, just like this, right? So this is what's called another nested while loop. So this while loop that I've written inside another while loop is called a nested while loop, okay? And in this, we can place whatever condition you want. Maybe we'll just say, maybe we create another variable, okay? We'll create this as j, and maybe that's going to be equal to something like 10, okay? And in here, what you want to do is basically, I'm going to place j is lower than, greater than or equal to 20, okay? While greater than or equal to 20. So this time I'm actually doing the exact same, right? I'm actually still going to increment the value of j because we've set it to 20. But what if I try something different? Maybe I'll say while j is equal to, or while j is greater than or equal to 0, right? So this time I actually have to, greater than or equal to does not make sense when you put a 0 in there, so I have to make that to lower than, right? So we've looked at that now. What I'm going to do is I have to increment the value of j, or should I say decrease the value of j, because this time it's the exact opposite, because j's value is actually bigger than what we set at equal to, right? We set 0, so we have to make it lower. So I'll just say, instead of saying j I plus is equal to 1, I'll say j minus is equal to 1. So this time it will decrease the value each time. So what should I do in this? Maybe I'll just print something like, in this nested while loop, I'll print Python with myth. What do you think is going to be the output here, right? What do you think is going to be the output? Okay, so let's see what happens. As you can see, it only printed Python. Why is that? Well, if you look here, what we're saying is while j is lower than or equal to 0. But it's actually never going to go into that loop because j is actually greater than 0 already, so the condition is already false. So it doesn't go into that while loop. So that's why you have to place greater than, okay? So then it will actually go into the loop. And this time, as you can see when I run it, it said Python, and then it printed Python with myth something like 11 times, and then it printed Python the other 5 times. Well, this is because the first time it went into the while loop, right, it printed Python and then went into the while loop. And then what it does is actually completely nested loop first and then go on to the loop again. So it goes outside the loop once it finishes all the nested loops inside it, right? So then it finished this loop, right? And it printed it like 11 times, and then it actually went back to this loop, went back to the actual outer loop, right? So this loop right here, the main loop, okay? So that's how you can write a nested while loop in a while loop.